Peace. What's up, YouTube? This is Drawya back with another video. We're gonna be talking about the first so-called black jockeys of America. Now, this article I found is called "How and Why Black Riders Were Driven from American Racetracks." As you see right here in this graph, it says African American and white jockeys in the Kentucky Derby from 1875 to 1911. You see right here, 1875, the majority of jockeys were so-called black men. This was in the late 1800s. Now, a lot of people, they don't know about this, and you may be wondering why. It's because they don't really want you to really know a lot of history um, apart from Jim Crow. They almost don't want you to think that so-called black people were anything until after Jim Crow and once they got into integration, because they want you to think that that's when so-called black people start to gain value in their lives. It's very psychological. It's very psychological warfare. But we had a history before Jim Crow. We had a history before slavery. And like I said, not all so-called black people came from slaves. So let's read a little bit about this article. So between 1890 and 1899, African American jockeys won the Kentucky Derby 6 times. By the early 1900s, they were history. And Jim Crow in the Saddle, the expulsion of African American jockeys from American racing. Michael Lees and Hugh Rockoff document the expulsion of African American jockeys from the Triple Crown races as a striking example of the surge in racism in the 1890s. The researchers suggest that horse racing provides a particularly helpful case study for untangling Jim Crow's effects because it was popular both in the North and the South, was integrated for years after the Civil War, and offers a quantitative data that reflect underlying attitudes. Using a new data set that includes information on all entrants in all races, they find some evidence of prejudice by horse owners and the betting public, but conclude that the final push for expulsion came from white jockeys who were determined to quote unquote draw the color line. In the years following the Civil War, as in pre-war era, most jockeys on Southern tracks were African American. At the first Kentucky Derby in 1875, 13 of 15 jockeys were African American. Wow. So the majority of jockeys were African American, huh? So-called black. Between 1890 and 1899, black jockeys won 6 derbies, 1 Preakness Stakes, and 3 Belmont Stakes. But in the early 1900s, black jockeys disappeared. Jimmy Winkfield was the last African American to win a Triple Crown race. In 1902, he was one of the last African Americans to ride in the Triple Crown race for almost a century. The researchers test for the presence of discrimination against black jockeys in 2 ways. First, they study the relationship between the rise of Jim Crow and the decline in the number of mounts going to black riders. Second, they examine whether a particular class of jockeys outperformed the odds, which reflect the bets that race spectators have placed. This test could detect spectator discrimination against black jockeys. So they were really trying to just kind of just make sure that they just kind of get rid of them. You know, wow, they were just really kind of discriminating on both sides with the owners and the people betting against them, to the point where I guess it wouldn't even be a good idea for the owner to really even have a black jockey, so-called black man as a jockey, because they wouldn't be getting the bets. The researchers do not find any evidence of racial prejudice by the betting public for races run on northern Triple Crown race tracks, but they found some evidence of such prejudice at the Kentucky Derby. Horses ridden by black jockeys were more likely to finish in the money, first, second, or third, than predicted by the odds. This suggests that the bettor preferences at the Derby may have contributed to the expulsion of African American jockeys. The key push to exclude black jockeys came when white jockeys began violently attacking their African American counterparts by boxing them out during races, running them into the rail, and hitting them with riding crops. These attacks prevented black jockeys from finishing in the money and endangered fragile and valuable racehorses. Soon after the attacks began, African American jockeys found they could not get rides. Anxiety over job insecurity appears to have played an important role in white jockeys' actions. There were only a limited number of riding slots. White jockeys would have benefited in any circumstances from the exclusion of black jockeys, but in the late 1890s, the U.S. was in a depression, and unease about finding rides was especially high, combined with a growing anti-gambling crusade that reduced attendance at racetracks and eliminated some tracks entirely. Jockeys found demand for their services contracting. Owners tactically participated in the expulsion of African American jockeys. For some, it could have been a matter of prejudice, but for others, it was likely a business decision. Why employ a black jockey if white jockeys would use violence to prevent him from finishing in the money and risk damaging a valuable horse in the process? The researchers conclude that African American jockeys were victims of discrimination at multiple levels. The findings add to the evidence that anxiety about jobs was an important contributing factor to the racism that produced Jim Crow. So they really were just so intimidated by these black jockeys, so-called black jockeys, that they had to basically try to cheat, you know, use intimidating factors and, cheat them during the race, block them off. They basically had a conspiracy to like make sure that they, don't win. So, the owners, they were just like, well, it's not no use in, trying to put you on my horse because they're going to damage my horse. So they basically got kicked out of the league, you know. And that's why, we see the Kentucky Derby as a white Caucasian event when the majority, we so-called black people actually dominating that sport, And that's the thing about our people. We can dominate anything if we play on a fair ground. That's why they have to cheat. That's why they have to put these regulations and these systems, what we call quote unquote white supremacy, because they know if we played in a fair race, we'll win. No pun intended. So, just interesting, man. Our history is very vast. It's nice to go over sometimes. Peace.